Made in God's image. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Well, we're going to get to that Made in God's image title in just a moment, but let me tell you where we start. We start with a Wall Street Journal editorial board comment this week called Human Absurdity Stock, Not Depleted. That's the headline. And here's where the editorial board is writing. They say, outrage politics rots the mind, and here's another tragic example. Quote, White House advisor Kevin Hassett uses dehumanizing term for U.S. workers, end quote, says a headline at Vox.com. The editorial board goes on to write, wow, what unutterable did Mr. Hassett let loose? He was speaking sunnily on CNN about the prospect of an economic recovery. Quote, our capital stock hasn't been destroyed, end quote, Mr. Hassett said. That quoting him again, our human capital stock is ready to get back to work, and so that there are lots of reasons to believe that we can get going way faster than we have in previous crises, end quote. And so people are taking on Mr. Hassett for using the term human capital stock. Well, as the editorial board points out, that's a very common term for us in economics. We say people have human capital. Even in my strategy class, we have an entire chapter on human capital and intellectual capital. And so this is a very typical term, and it's nothing to get upset about. People have human capital. As a matter of fact, what Mr. Hassett was talking about there, I did a session on that, an episode a couple of weeks ago, number 22, episode number 22 of mine was called Nothing Was Destroyed. And my point is, construction workers have their tool belt hanging on a hook at the back door. It's ready to go. But I won't repeat that from 22. But Mr. Hassett was saying the same thing. He was saying our human capital stock is ready to get back to work. So our question today is, why do we have this disagreement between Christians and seemingly non-Christians about calling people human capital stock? Because it's a common term we use in economics. Let me refer to an article titled Made in God's Image by Allie Hale from Greenville University, writing in Light and Life magazine. Here's what she says. Christians based this phrase, made in God's image, mainly from Genesis 1:26, which reads, Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. End quote, Genesis 1:26. And Allie Hale goes on to say in Light and Life magazine, it gives us great value and purpose, what we as economists call human capital stock. Back to Allie Hale. We shouldn't just see the inherent value in ourselves, but seek to view it in those around us. That's exactly what Mr. Hassett was doing. He was viewing the human capital in the people around him. One more sentence from Allie Hale in Light and Life magazine. This verse doesn't just talk about us being God's handiwork, but declares we each are called to fulfill good works. We are so valuable that God entrusted tasks for each of us to carry out for the betterment of his kingdom. God has gifted us each unique talents and abilities. Therefore, your calling is going to look different than someone else's. End of the quote from Allie Hale in Light and Life magazine. Thank you, Allie. We are made in God's image. And Christian economists believe this. And since we're made in God's image, we are creative. Have you ever thought about that term? Everybody uses this term. They say humans are creative. Then wouldn't you assume we were created? How can you be creative without being created? And where did this creativity come from? Well, we as Christian economists believe this creativity came from the Creator. That's why we're creative. We're made in the image of God. Yeah, let me refer you back to one of my other episodes. It was number 3. It was called 1 versus 100. Number 1, and that number 1 is from the ranking of countries and their economic freedom. Number 1 was Hong Kong, and number 100 was China. And in episode 3, I talked about that. Guess what? Wall Street Journal editorial board is talking about that today. And you know what they're saying? They're talking about human capital, what we call made in the image of God. And what they're suggesting is, this is fascinating, China has had this policy. I've been to China a couple of times, Hong Kong once, And in Hong Kong, they make this. They use this phrase: one country, two policies. One country, two policies. This week, China has changed their mind. One country, one policies. One policy. Well, Hong Kongers are upset about this. Now, in 1999, when the British gave up their 150-year rule of Hong Kong, many Hong Kongers could see this coming and many of them fled. Many to Vancouver. I don't have time today to talk about how the real estate prices in Canada have been driven up so much by that, but they have a 30% tax in Vancouver for internationals buying real estate. You know why? Because all those Hong Kongers fled to Vancouver. These are really productive people. They have a great deal of human capital. That's why Hong Kong is number one in the ranking that I talked about just a moment ago by heritage.org, Index of Economic Freedom. So look at it. You've got these people who are very creative, who are creating a lot of value. They've made Hong Kong one of the richest cities in the world. And now China's stepping in and saying, you're going to have the same rules as the rest of China. Here's what the editorial board says this week in the Wall Street Journal about that case. Here's what they should do. They're saying that President Trump should give them visas and allow them to come to the U.S. Now, I'll think about this. When you were a kid and you were picking up teams to play softball or soccer or whatever you were doing, right? Somebody'd pick, somebody'd pick, somebody'd pick, somebody'd pick. Okay, if you were last, I'm sorry, but that just meant you weren't very good at soccer or softball. You were very good at other things. They were picking. Look, that's what the Wall Street Journal editorial board is saying to President Trump this week. You've got some high draft picks over there in Hong Kong. Let's get them here in the U.S. because we want people in the U.S. with great human capital. We want people who are productive, who can work, who are using what us Christian economists say is can I say the correct word in philosophical terms? Imago Dei. Sorry if I mispronounced that. No, that's right. Imago Dei. Made in the image of God because they're producing for their fellow neighbors. Okay, here's the Wall Street Journal editorial board saying why Trump should do this, why he should allow these productive Hong Kongers to come to the U.S. Quote, this is the kind of Reagan-esque move that would remind the world of America's big heart and faith and freedom. It would certainly be heard in Beijing, which would watch in horror as hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong Chinese took up the visa offers. The U.S. would benefit from a rush of new talent that is well-educated and entrepreneurial. End quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial board this week. I agree with them. When you're drafting for your team, you want the best players. You want those who, we use the term in Christian economics, those who are using the image of God to create value for their neighbors. We want those people. Look, we've often shaken our head at American policies. I mean, at the university, we have these great students come from China and India and other countries as well. And I don't understand all the details, so if I make a mistake, forgive me here. But what we essentially say is, yes, you can come here and get a degree, but then you have to leave and go back to your home country. Do you realize what that policy is doing? We are saying to the best and the brightest, you can't stay here. Economists shake our head. We say, no. You want the best people to stay here. Why are you forcing them to go back? I mean, it's been shown over and over again that human capital are subject today, made in the image of God is the religious term, the economic term, the human capital. Where did you think the human capital came from? It came because we're made in the image of God. So we use these two terms. Religious term is made in God's image. Economic terms is human capital stock. How much of it do we have? Well, my friend Hugh Welchel, in his book called How Then Should We Work, has this great phrase. Listen to this. He said, God made something of nothing. Our charge is to make something of something. End quote from Hugh Welchel, How Then Should We Work? That's the point. We are supposed to do something. Look, I've got these seniors in my class in strategy, and I say to them, if I'd go to your home, your parents would show me your room, and there'd be a picture of you when you were playing soccer at 5 or 6 or 7 years old. How many of you currently play soccer? And maybe one or two raise their hands. I said, okay, that means the other 30 of you, somewhere along the way, someone advised you, maybe soccer is not the best thing for you to do. See, in economic terms, somebody was saying to them, your human capital stock is best used doing something other than soccer. And this woman, Allie Hale, said the same thing in her article in Light and Life magazine. We shouldn't all do the same thing. See, you're being directed how to produce value for your neighbors. Look, we have creativity because we're created. It's the only place it could come from. Yeah. And this gets to the point of how do you treat humans? I won't spend much time on abortion today, but the point is, see, if you think humans are made in God's image, you protect them. If you think they're not made in God's image, there's no reason to protect them. So abortion makes perfectly good sense, right? If the fetus was not made in God's image, you can do with it as you wish. But if it was made in God's image, then you have to treat it very differently. See, Adam Smith called this self-love. See, so many people outside of Christian economics think that people are greedy and they're doing things for themselves. You get in an economics class, and it's not very long before you figure out, when we talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, the point is that both parties get richer when people work, when they use their imago Dei, when they have used their human capital stock to create value for others. Look, one of my favorite scriptures in Christian economics is, therefore you're left with two great commands: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you love your neighbor, you will produce consumer surplus. You'll produce products and services that they desire. If you love yourself, you will have producer surplus, meaning you make a profit at the same time. Look, it comes back to this so often. Made in God's image. If we're made in God's image, we use that skill, that creativity from God to create value for others. As the Hong Kongers do, as Mr. Hassett was talking about in the White House the other day, we have human capital stock. We just call it made in God's image. There you go. I'm the Christian economist, Dave Arnott, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.